Today I'd like to continue our journey through the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 6 and talk about that first section of chapter 6, which deals with prayer and the importance of prayer in terms of developing a relationship with God. Jesus really is looking for a prayer that flows from God's gracious initiative. So the first aspect of prayer is to realize that it is God who is inviting us into the prayer. And then the second aspect that Jesus is stressing is prayer that responds in deeds of a right relationship with God. So it is prayer that really comes forth from God. It's God's initiative. God is inviting us into the prayer relationship. The initiative is really not from us. The initiative in prayer is always from God. Prayer is God's invitation to experience God in a deeper, more meaningful, more personal, more intimate way. And then once we've experienced this intimacy with God, then from that relationship, our deeds flow. We want to take that love that God has given us and share that love, obviously, with everybody that we encounter. Some examples of this we see throughout the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 23, that takes place before Jesus walked on the water to meet the apostles in the boat. The wind was blowing very strongly. Peter is very enthusiastic and very eager to show that he loves Jesus. So what Peter does is that he says, "I will come and meet you, Jesus." And Jesus says, "Sure, come and meet me." But Peter has this moment of kind of hesitation, maybe doubt. You can't trust completely in Jesus in terms of walking on the water, and I think it would be difficult for any of us in that situation to say, "Oh, no problem, I'll just go and walk on the water and meet Jesus." I mean, it's like, what am I doing here? And of course, the first couple of steps, no problem, and then he's going down, and Jesus rescues him. Jesus saves him, and they go back to the boat together. And Jesus says at the conclusion of this, after doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. So Jesus is taking the initiative to respond to God's call. God has given him the call to pray, to be with God. And so Jesus goes by himself alone. The importance of that individual prayer with God. Certainly communal prayer, where we gather with many people, is important, but also that quiet time, that individual time, that time with God is important. And so Matthew stresses that in chapter 14, verse 23, just after that encounter with Peter. As you reflect on that, you might think, well, maybe Jesus was a bit disappointed in the reaction of the apostles, the reaction of Peter in particular. They're not really trusting completely in him. And Jesus goes to God and shares his feelings about that, his feelings about the apostles and their response to him. And of course, it's not just the apostles. Their response is probably the best, but it's still, as we see, very inadequate. But then the response of the Pharisees, the scribes, the leaders, the people, the difficult for Jesus to encounter all that and take that in. And so he needs time with God, to talk to God about that, to share his ministry, to share his ups and downs with God. Then in Matthew 19, verse 13, it says, the children were brought to him, that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked them. Jesus says that the children should come to him, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Jesus placed his hands on them and then went away. So there again, it's perhaps a lack of understanding on the part of the apostles. They don't want to bother Jesus. Jesus is busy proclaiming the kingdom, and so they don't want to bring the children. And Jesus has to rebuke them and say, no, children should come. And then Jesus prays in a beautiful, intimate, loving, kind way with the children. Really a beautiful scene when you reflect on it in terms of Jesus' concern for them and Jesus sharing prayer with the children. And then in Matthew 26, verses 36 to 46, we have the experience of the agony in the garden. Jesus' prayer is, yet not as I will, but you will. In some ways, isn't that the perfect prayer? We're praying for God's will. We might have encountered disappointments in our daily life. We might have encountered struggles, difficulties. Might be a lot of things that are throwing us off. But Jesus says, not as I will, but as you will. So again, it's that sense of trust in God, giving ourselves completely to God and saying, God, I trust in the direction that you are giving me. I trust that you are with me. I trust that you will help me. You have initiated this prayer in me, and you will guide me. You will lead me. And through that lead, I will be able to do those deeds of righteousness, those deeds of love, those deeds of kindness, as you lead me. Because what I want to do is your will and not my will. And Jesus says that, of course, in one of the more difficult times in his ministry, the agony in the garden, when he's reflecting on what is going to happen and preparing himself for the passion, the suffering that will befall him very shortly. Jesus then, in the next section in chapter 6, which is verses 9 to 15, teaches the Lord's Prayer. So Jesus comes from giving us certain basic guidelines about prayer. It shouldn't be demonstrative and showy, and it should relate to God and God's initiative. Then he teaches the apostles the perfect prayer, the Lord's Prayer. It is also found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verses 2 to 4, and it's a different form than we see in Matthew. It's a much shorter form, but in essence, it is similar. So Jesus prays, first of all, Our Father in heaven. This is found in many rabbinic prayers of the post-New Testament period. So this was a common way in this period of addressing God. Our, of course, stresses the communal nature of faith. It is not my Father, it is our Father. And so we are all bonded together in this act of faith, this act of prayer. We are all sisters and brothers. We are all united. We are one as we pray to God our Father. The term Father was not unique to Jesus. There are texts from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Qumran, writings, Philo, Josephus, early Christian writers and Jewish writers, and also rabbinic literature in which this metaphor is used of God. It is used 53 times in Matthew, so it is a quite common phrase in the Gospel of Matthew. Other metaphors for God in terms of not just Father, Matthew 13:33 speaks of God as a baker woman, someone who is busy there making the bread. In Matthew 23:37, like Psalm 91, a bird that gathers her fledglings under her wings. So God is gathering us together. So there are many ways of speaking about God. And Jesus uses these metaphors to give us a sense of that intimate relationship with God. In all of them, you can see that commonality, that God is present, that God is part of our everyday experience, that God comes to us in our lives to fill them with love and joy and peace.